people live on fossil fuels. The economies of a couple of states of India will go to dust if these people actually lose fossil fuels, and their livelihoods are dependent on it. We have seen these arguments even in the United States. West Virginia, it opposes climate change because coal is integral to its economy. There are states in India where these things are integral to the economy. That's also a transition we need to plan for. To go with that, there are state economic transitions. We forget that petroleum and petroleum products are a major source of revenue for states. So the moment these things go, the entire fiscal balance of Indian government is going to change. I mean, currently the only source of independent revenue which states can actually tamper with is petroleum taxes. And if petroleum is going to vanish, what else is there in states in terms of taxation? So these are transition which has to be looked at very, very carefully. And mind you, it's not easy. There has to be an industrial transition which we are all aware of. I think another session handled that. All the industries, steel, cement, aluminium, and a host of others have to do that. We also are quite familiar with there has to be a change in mobility, EVs replacing vehicles. And also we forget another thing, the transition in the construction sector. I mean, people think that, the carbon in the atmosphere largely comes from, this energy, and we think of polluting thermal power plant. The total pollution from thermal power plants in terms of carbon contribution is less than that of industry, of construction, and of mobility put together. So that's actually as big, if not, and we forget agriculture. That's also an equally big, pollutant, quote unquote. And to go with all these, countries are developing, there are going to be lifestyle transitions. There are aspirations of the people of the developing world, the global south, who would like to have lifestyles similar to the developed world, the global north. And these lifestyles are unsustainable, so there have to be lifestyle transitions in terms of expectation. And to go with all that, all this word of just and sustainable transition, who is to pay for what? I think that is that. But having said all that, I mean, all countries are entitled to development aspirations, but as I said in the beginning, this transition is a must. There is no escape, so everybody has to address it. And therefore, that's the challenge. And the challenge then is to how do you finance it? And I think that's what the session and your panelists will be talking about that. And I'm just highlighting four of, I mean, India, for example, is creating something called a UK-India Infrastructure Financing Bridge, which is about actually wanting to become, and London is one of the three major sources of finance in the world, structuring sustainable projects, sustainable energy projects, which are amenable to global finance. I think that is missing. I mean, ministries do their thing in isolation, the private sector does their thing in isolation, and one of the problems we are noticing is cheap long-term capital, which is insurance funds, mutual funds, they are not coming to India. It's largely private equity which is coming to India. So if you want to get this energy transition going, you need to get this cheap capital going. There are also information asymmetry risks, and this is like, if you want to get private flows going, what do you need to do?
As somebody who has worked on the ground in India, overall framework with which you approach this question of increasing this pipeline?
Thanks, Mayur. And I think CEO and NITI Aayog framed a very interesting and a very broad, I would say, facet to this entire question. Just a quick introduction of what we do. And by the way, that's not me. That's a smarter looking Abhishek Poddar. We represent about $600 billion of AUM investing in infrastructure, energy transition, both mature renewables as well as emerging technologies across the globe. A large part of that is actually in more developed markets, but increasingly we're seeing more on the emerging markets as well. And then there's part of Macquarie where we do a lot of carbon solutions and likes of those kind of things, right? I think from our perspective, I mean, as we look at the problem, and depending on who you speak, people who say it's every year we need about $4 trillion. If you meet Mark Carney, he will say $8 trillion per annum. Is break it down, right? And let's look at some of these success stories. And our experience has been very simple. Whenever technologies and countries, they've defined, established frameworks, regulatory frameworks, transparent frameworks like auctions, FITs, capital flows in. Renewables is a very classic case in point, right? You look at India, in the emerging markets, you look at India, Brazil, Vietnam, capital has flown in, long-term capital like us, very competitive capital, pension funds and likes of those kind of things. The problem happens when either the technologies are mature but the country frameworks are not in place, and there are many countries, even in the global south, where the framework has not been done, where global investors like us do ascribe a very high risk premium to this, right? So there the solution is just, follow what's been proven in many of the markets and do it. It's easier said than done. We're part of the jet fees in Vietnam and Indonesia, and both the good and bad that we are seeing. But the answer is actually as simple as that. Then you have the other side of technology, of energy transition, which are the emerging technologies, the electric vehicles, the green hydrogen, the battery storages, and likes of those. Those are fundamentally at a risk, as a higher risk proposition today than the mature technologies. Juxtapose on top of that the emerging market risk of currency, etc. Many investors and the investors that I represent do find it difficult. And that's where I think the concept of blended finance, and that's something which we are very closely working with, where public sector comes in, de-risk it, underwrites a certain downside protection, and then the large-scale private sector comes in. In our mind, that's the right solution. And there's a case in point where we are right now in partnership with Green Climate Fund, putting out a $1.5 billion leasing and financing company focused on just electric vehicles in India, where GCF has committed $200 million of concessional high-risk equity, and we are bringing in $4 billion of our capital, right? So there are many of these kind of models that exist, and which is what we've been working on.
Thank you so much, Mr. Poddar. I'm going to turn to you now, Dr. Fenton. And the question essentially here that was raised is, there are sometimes, in the absence of structures in receiving recipient countries for climate finance,
out there, and it really makes me feel the urgency. Look, from the EIB side, we are very proud of the fact that we are the largest multilateral on some measurements. Even though we're 90% active in Europe, we do around 10, 12 billion a year outside the EU. It's sizable. We've done 4.5 billion here in India, more or less. But are we doing enough to catalyze private finance? We are absolutely not. In India, most of our finance is actually with the public sector. So we're investing in metros, we're investing in renewable energy via SBI, via IREDA. And these are fantastic projects, don't get me wrong. But we need to be, if we're serious about really scaling up, we need to be bolder. And we need to be getting behind innovative technologies, we need to be getting behind the hard projects. Just a few thoughts about what we need to do to make a transition clarity of purpose. And over the past 2 years, I've really seen our president going around and talking about us being EU Climate Bank. We've committed to being Paris aligned, so we're no longer financing fossil fuels, and we're doing over 50% focused on climate and environment. And that really, really matters. That has led to a culture within the institution. But we have to hold that line. We can't be distracted, and thank you to India actually for really keeping us on it. The other thing we have to do is really this boldness, and that involves really becoming a proper bank, right? So understanding that we really have to take risk, and we have to be serious about assessing that risk and taking bets. We should be gambling, we should be losing money, losing taxpayer money, and that's uncomfortable, but that's a cultural change that needs to happen from the top to the bottom, and including, when we go to our risk management officers, when we go to our legal team, so they don't say, oh, but this is a weird financial structure, we can't sign off on it. It has to really be throughout. And then finally, the resources, because, everyone always says, okay, with the private sector, you can catalyze funds, you can do more with less. Yes, but if you can't give us less as our stakeholders and expect us to do more. So we're going to need backing from our stakeholders in the form of guarantee, and we're going to need people, right? So when the financial crisis hit in Europe, we launched, it was called FC, European Fund for Stabilization and Investment, I forget, and we managed to do a huge amount, but we hired a lot of people, and I don't see that happening yet. I think we're moving in that direction. It's going to have to happen. And finally, we have to be much better at coordinating between each other. There's so much to do. There shouldn't be any competition. Usually there isn't, but I still see it. I still see we need to talk better to each other. Thank you.
Thank you. There are two follow-up, and there are two ideas that have been raised that I'm going to follow up later. One is on early stage investments into risky technologies. The other one is about people, and I think that's really important. But for now, I'm going to turn to you, Nikita-san. And we've heard something about what it takes for a multilateral organization to change. As a bilateral organization, you have far less trouble scaling up. You only have one stakeholder to convince if you want to increase your capital. What are the ways, however, in which you feel you have been able to transform the way that institutions like yours look at this sector, broaden their perspective of the kind of projects they're willing to invest in, and make a change?
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, after hearing my friends and colleagues here and from bilateral
Longer term financial planners should be doing to help you. What is it that regulation will be doing to make it easier for you?
Great question. I first actually want to start by acknowledging all the wonderful founders, entrepreneurs, technologists in the room. We have lots of big finance, big companies, but they are the ones actually driving change. So please give a round of applause. And I must appreciate and compliment GAP and ORF for bringing in those who are actually going boldly where no one has gone before, and creating the new models, both product innovation and process innovation models that will effect the changes that we need to be brought about at scale with speed. So technology is critical. Let me share with everyone what we do at Avana. We are India's first early stage technology fund focused solely on climate. So we don't also do climate, we only do climate. We invest in early stage technologies, sort of pre-Series A, Series A, that are solving and creating fundamental solutions for energy transition, circular economy, industrial decarbonization, climate resilient agriculture, mobility and supply chain. So this is roughly sort of 90% of India's emission footprint, 70% of the economy, all of which has to move very rapidly at scale for the world to get to the right place on climate, not just India. We are finding amazing technologies and technologists and founders and entrepreneurs who, if we can solve for 1.4 billion people in India at our price points, and we are a very price sensitive country, lower middle income country, project finance, commercial capital. We also need the risk mitigation to be brought in by public finances. We had a session earlier today on MDBs. In addition to that, there is a need for innovation finance. So who is financing innovation? This is not your old venture capital model of fintech, consumer tech, SaaS playbook, hockey sticks. You cannot think about it like this. This is hard, deep tech. It will have a different growth trajectory. We have to find ways to through private capital, but also create the pools of capital, just as we are thinking of utility scale renewable energy. I would submit utility scale renewable energy is actually a commercial proposition. It's lower risk. So I wonder why there is so much development financing going into that. It's great risk, right? You can raise 8 to 12% money globally hedged. Where is the money really going for innovation? It does not require that much capital, but as Reena mentioned earlier, I think there needs to be a change. You said, what are the asks? The asks are a change in thinking about risk and being willing to take some experimental risk here. Better linkages with our R&D system, laboratories, universities. So if I go back to the tiers of capital, different levels, layers of risk. The final tier of capital really is what the Rockefeller Foundation and GAP have taken a really, really big step on, which is philanthropic capital. Philanthropic capital has the ability with the stakeholder, purpose-driven capital to actually fund a lot of this innovation. And we saw yesterday with the Entice Awards, in the whole Entice program, that this is exactly what we need a lot more of.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kilka.
Last 2 days, and thank you again very, very much for this wonderful conference. I hope not only will it convene every year, but we're going to have some strong action tracks to Nina's point about the urgency and to Mr. Subramanian's point about the scale of the challenge ahead. So let's act together, and it would be wonderful to be in partnership. Thank you, GIAC, thank you, ORF, for convening this. If we 4 hours, and from Mr. Singh this morning, the landscape, and we've heard it from Stern Songway as well, of how the world financial architecture has to evolve to provide concessional finance. We must recognize a heroic effort is being made to trigger that finance in very difficult circumstances of higher inflation, of fiscal balance sheets that are very stressed. So every little precious piece of that concessional finance should go as far as it possibly can. Working with sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, for the last 17 years, we've asked ourselves only one question, which is how do we move the many, many trillions of dollars? The organization I advise, the IRR, is $12 trillion, 45 sovereign and sub-sovereign funds. How do we move their money in practice into emerging infrastructure? Not your part, Anjali, but the downstream on the scale up, which Stern always says there are a lot of numbers floating around. is $1 trillion of extra finance every year for emerging market green infrastructure. How do we do it in practice? And it seems to me with the very limited amount of concessional finance that what we've learned from experiments all across the planet can enable dramatic de-risk, this is to your point, Abhishek, earlier, in a way that's very systematic. So we can get the maximum amount of lowering of risk relative to return in the way that Mr. Subramanian was saying needed to be done, risk and return, cost of capital, but we do it systematically. And that's what's missing. We have little experiments in Colombia and India, we've done a lot of good things. All over the world we can see this. Can we systematize it? And yes, we can. So we've submitted, and you very kindly at ORF have published, or I should say the T20 has taken up this idea, what we call the 3x5 framework. And that is to say that we should include institutional investors ab initio in identifying the risks in a dialogue that is a dialogue of trust with government, with industry investors from the beginning in 5 stages. Stage number 1, we argue, is the government should set very clear signals and stick to them. You saw that these links all happen, but it takes 10 to 15 years. We have to do that in 2 years. So therefore we need everyone in a room together to crack the risks and work on it. This 3rd stage is what we keep hearing about, pipeline development.
Is India as an energy hub in the Indo-Pacific. Now, every global crisis we have, and we seem to have a lot these days, seems to have an energy dimension. So, how can India become a hub for value creation in the Indo-Pacific at a time of such energy volatility and yet secure its and its region's energy security?
Thank you, Ashok. My apologies to all of you, but I'd gone to Alwar for election campaigning and got a little late coming into the city. And some of my getting late is also because of the huge traffic along the way, which is very much reflective of the energy and the buzz that we have all over the city and the country today, with relentless growth in almost every sector, leading to huge demand for energy. Energy, whether it's to power the automobiles or energy to power our venues, our hotels, our homes, our businesses. The demand is just growing relentlessly. And in the car, I was just seeing the petroleum import numbers. That's another figure which is just going off the roof. What I'm trying to say is that India is currently in a phase where for the next 30 years, we're going to see huge amount of growth in the economy. And obviously that's going to lead to significant demand for energy in all our walks of life. So our transition has 2 dimensions. A, what do we do to transit from the past consumption levels, and what do we do to meet the needs of this growth? And both collectively make this a very big challenge. In the circumstances that we are in, we've been upping our targets, increasing our targets on almost every aspect of the energy transition story, be it getting clean energy into the system, our efforts to replace the demand for crude oil with maybe electric vehicles, then the simultaneous effort to make sure that the clean energy-based vehicles are introduced in the market so we don't have coal producing electricity only to power an electric vehicle. So our transition has a very large end dimension on which we are working so that we start our entire energy need with a clean source. We use the circular economy principles in terms of recycling, reuse, and ensure that we also focus a little bit on energy efficiency. We have gentleman in the room who was powering the LED revolution in the country. So I think broadly India is working on many fronts. We are also supporting the production of energy, clean energy equipment in India, hoping to transition to green hydrogen and then green ammonia so that at scale clean energy can become the source for our growth. It's a combination of different factors which collectively will help us transition out from the past into a glorious future where the kind of difficulties that we are seeing all over the world, we don't have to go through those difficulties for far too long. We are facing a stress right now, but our effort is that matching with our growth, we are able to transition both for the future and to take care of the past.
Minister, I'll just pick up from one of the points you made about pushing manufacturing of green relevant equipment. Now, one of the key initiatives of this government has been the production-linked incentive program, which has worked very well with mobile phones and now consumer electronics and appliances. How is this scheme relevant to green sectors and green industries?
I think it's most relevant. It's one of the finest, well-thought, well-crafted areas of government policy to promote manufacturing in India. And it's not only mobile phones, it's cutting across several sectors, auto components, specialty steels, textiles, technical textiles. So we've been able to identify specific areas in which production-linked incentive schemes are under operation in a few areas, but largely still under implementation in most areas, where schemes were introduced only post-COVID. I think in green energy, we have some investments coming in for solar, highly efficient solar PV manufacturing, PV module manufacturing. Green hydrogen also has received some government support. But I think these are the areas in energy efficiency. We have, for example, LED bulbs. We have gone in for all the components of LED bulbs receiving support under the PLI scheme, so that our import dependence on LED bulbs reduces significantly. So like that, every aspect of energy, we should be able to support wherever required. We have certain aspects where the support is possibly indirect. Ethanol, for example, the support is only in terms of our buying the ethanol that is produced in the country and allowing its blending in petrol products. Other than that, we don't need to give a cash support. We do give some interest subsidy for those who are setting up ethanol plants. Broadly, what we are looking at is seeing where the support is really required and where the program can be self-sufficient. Ideally, I am one of those who believes that subsidies can only be like a kickstart. When a motorcycle is being started or a scooter is being started, you give that extra kick and get the machine going. After that, it runs on its own using minimal energy or energy source. I think the PLI schemes broadly function on that principle. The effort is only to give it that momentum in the initial period. But ultimately, Michael Porter's theory will work, that every country will have its own competitive advantages or comparative advantages amongst nations. And wherever we'll be competitive, wherever we'll have ability to produce high quality goods at efficient and competitive prices, we'll make a mark.
Minister, you spoke about comparative advantage. Right now, obviously the key imperative in trade. You are in a sense India's FTA minister, that's your responsibility as Commerce Minister. How key are green energy imperatives while negotiating FTAs?
I think the world is still to come to terms with the responsibilities that different nations have when it comes to this green, clean energy transition. We had all agreed in Paris at COP21 that different nations will have different levels of responsibility. And based on the responsibility matrix, we'll also have to work out the financing and the availability of technologies. We have yet to see the world come up to the expectation, the developed world, come up to the expectations of, or the needs of funding, particularly low cost, long tenor funding that would be required for meeting the transition financing needs. At the bare minimum, and I think this figure really has no great significance in terms of its ability to assure total transition, but at the very bare minimum, it was expected that $100 billion would be made available by the developed world, the polluters in the first place. After all, India is not the person who's responsible for this mess up there. Despite supporting 17% of global population, our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions or the depletion of the ozone layer is barely 2.5%. So we are not the polluters in the first place. And keeping in mind the polluter pays principle, it was expected that these countries would go that extra mile by providing very low cost or zero cost, long tenor funding, grant-based funding to encourage the less developed countries and developing world to transition. Sadly, they have let down the whole world. And neither do I see the ability nor the enthusiasm in the developed world to really meet that obligation. Secondly, energy transition also has a lot of technology needs. I'll share two specific examples to give clarity to the needs, how important technology can be when we are looking at transition. If we see the air conditioning, the traditional air conditioning leaves behind a huge impact on the ozone layer. Newer ways of cooling, newer technologies have been developed, but that technology is held by a cozy club of 2 or 3 companies who charge an arm and a leg for it, because of which it's so unaffordable that consumers in, let's say, a country like India cannot be forced to pay that higher value because of the sins of people in another country who have enjoyed all the benefits of low cost and have messed up the environment during their development cycle. So a country in Europe, which is today a $50,000-$60,000 or $100,000 per capita economy, has achieved that on the back of low cost of energy. Very easy to preach to the rest of us today that we should be doing something to keep environmental concerns before us when we take policy or when we ask our consumers to spend more. But the reality is the consumer is going to say, I never caused this problem in the first place. Why should I pay for the sins of somebody else? And therefore technology will have to be made available so that that extra cost on air conditioning will not be borne by our consumers, and the huge profit that certain technology developers make has to be socialized to allow this energy transition to happen. The second and more important element is the transition from coal. India is one of those countries which has massively injected intermittent power, whether it's wind or solar. These are intermittent sources of power. They are not available on a steady state basis through the day. Particularly in the peak hours, you could be totally stressed out if one was to look at even greater degree of renewable energy. So the base load, which today in India is coal, needs to be replaced by an alternate base load. I remember so many conversations with very senior leaders where I'm telling them, give us an alternative, we are happy to change. But nobody in the world has any viable alternative to offer. Some people do talk about nuclear, but I don't think there is enough capability or capacity to even manufacture nuclear plants needed for the growth in our power requirement. Forget what we are already consuming. Our annual 8-10% growth in power also cannot be met by all the nuclear plants that are made all over the world. So I think the world will have to recognize this very serious challenge of an alternate base load to coal before they preach to us that we have to look at transiting from the old traditional sources.
Just to take the logic of what you spoke about, concern you because these are somehow violate equity.
Well, certainly any such taxes sought to be imposed are a matter of concern because there's a lot of uncertainty around these developments. Right now, of course, there's a reporting requirement that was kicked in last month. The tax, the carbon border adjustment mechanism tax, CBAM, will start sometime in 2026. But personally, I think we in India need not be concerned about it beyond the stage. Of course, we are in dialogue with the European Union and the European countries and their leadership to understand more about it and to see how this will play out. But there are two aspects which I would like all of you to know, and therefore you can rest assured that you are in safe hands. The government is seized of the issue fully and is in dialogue, and solutions will be found. One, if the country from which the goods originate taxes carbon at the level at which the European Union taxes their domestic companies, then there will be no additional tax on our exports to those countries. So if we collect the tax in India itself and use it for our green energy transition, which indirectly will help the same companies who are exporters as they transition to cleaner energy and bring down their carbon footprint, there will be no additional CBAM tax at the European border. And they'll find a solution, a domestic tax which will take care of equating European and Indian taxes. Of course, we are talking to them that the unfair part is, how can carbon be priced the same in India as it is priced in Europe? So we are still in negotiation on that aspect. But as long as we keep the taxes at home, utilize it for our own green energy transition, I think we would have an uncompetitive edge in our exports to Europe. Their own concern is they're trying to make their own industries survive. Because if they tax carbon in Europe and we do not, their own domestic industry will collapse. And I think it's only fair that every country has to at least provide their own companies or manufacturers a level playing field. So I don't grudge them that. They could jolly well as impose it like a GST or a VAT, a domestic VAT. Then they would be entitled to have a countervailing duty on their borders for anything we exported. In fact, that could have been worse for us. This is better that we have an opportunity to keep it. But I'll give you the other dimension, which I keep repeating to all the friends from Europe, including my meeting with the Commissioner last week, where I said that this step is going to cause the death knell of manufacturing in Europe. Now just imagine, steel or aluminium is only a base product. On the top of that will be all the value-added products that are manufactured there. First casualty I can visualize is the auto sector. Auto sector in Europe will be over, which will be a great opportunity for countries like India to develop a very vibrant auto sector. Because every input that gets costlier in Europe, particularly for a market which is a big exporter of their goods and services, everything that they're actually shooting themselves in the foot is what my personal assessment is, and I've been sharing it with the Europeans. I'm not so much worried. I think one of these days they'll themselves realize and they'll have to drop this CBAM. It's ill-conceived and has not addressed the entire issue correctly and fairly. They will have to give different values to the less developed and developing countries and try and bring a level playing field in smarter ways than trying to hurt us or our exports.
Thank you. That's very good to know, Minister. I now move to the G20. India has just concluded a very successful G20 summit. Do you think countries of the global south led by India can actually put together a green energy value chain?
Well, one of the important announcements on the sidelines of G20 was the corridor which we have launched, the IMEC, India, Middle East, Europe corridor. I think if you look into it, you'll realize that this is the type of joint initiatives which will have a huge impact in our energy transition goals also. I don't know how many of you recall, it was when Prime Minister Modi was the Chief Minister of Gujarat that he had articulated his thoughts on one earth, one sun, one earth, one grid. Now, maybe 15 years back when he first spoke about it, was around 2008 if I remember correctly. Maybe somebody can Google and take out that date. But around 2008 the Prime Minister Modi said, one sun, one earth, one grid. And there are studies that say that the sun gives us enough power that it can meet the energy needs of the entire world. Where our problem is that sun shines at different parts of the globe at different times. But if you imagine an interconnected grid all over the world, you will have each country receiving power during its peak hours from another country that doesn't need it at that point of time, and we sending our power, surplus power in the afternoon hours when we may not need that to another country which is experiencing peak loads or peak demand. Now that is one of the outcomes of this IMEC, and frankly this is expected to go all the way across to Singapore and then to Australia. So what Prime Minister Modi, being a visionary, had articulated 15 years ago, today the world is waking up to recognize that as a very powerful program which can hugely impact our energy transition mission. And you saw the impact of that. I don't know if very often people forget, but I'm sure Mr. Verma or Mr. Sinha sitting here who were in government actively at that point of time. They remember when this government came into being at the center in May of 2014. Just look back at the amount of stress the power sector was going through. Almost large parts of India would plunge into darkness. I myself became power minister on 26 May 2014, and by 29th May I think there was a huge grid collapse in northern India. And the entire Delhi and its surrounding states were without power for days. I remember spending full nights at the banks of the Yamuna and all, looking at all the transmission towers coming up again, and Mr. Sinha was the power secretary with me at that point of time. Your good friend Vinay Chatterjee had written an op-ed on my starting my word, baptism by outage. That was the situation. Thank you. He is the architect of the LED revolution in India, by the way. तुम्हारे को आज के दिन और पॉलिटिकल न्यूज़ ज़्यादा है इसके